Okay, hello and welcome to GEOG-1026, Visualizing Our Future. This is tutorial B for week 2, and the theme this week is conservation and ecology. And so let's just jump right in, and where better to start than just some random Google image searches. I kind of think that, at least when I was younger, I always thought of conservation as something more of a kind of a moral stance, or so, the opposing forces of development and conservation. Conservation were the good guys, right? Like that's kind of what I think we're taught when we're younger, that we need to save the rainforest, and we need to. There are certain types of creatures that will die if we don't help them, and none of these things are untrue. But I think the narrative is just a moral or a kind of ethical thing to do. And so, when I grew up, I thought of conservationists as people like, John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, but I think in planning, it's a little bit more literal, right? It's literally land, right? Where land is either owned by someone or it's owned by someone else. And should that land kind of be used for some human purpose, and what should it be used for? And that's kind of the realm of zoning, or should it be set aside for some purpose? And that's also zoning, but that's kind of what conservation is, I think, to a planner. What is land that we are going to intentionally not develop, and what are we going to have its use be if it's not going to have, buildings or businesses or homes and things like that? I mean, actually, the example of Central Park is kind of interesting because it's pretty far from conserved land, right? It seems like maybe this is a place where, okay, well, we're trying to keep development from happening. But I mean, in reality, Central Park was, there were several villages. I think one was called Pigtown, which was a German and Irish immigrant village, and then Seneca Village, which was African American families. And so those were private landowners that used to live in this area that through eminent domain, their land was taken away so they could construct kind of this green space. So anyway, this is just to all say that our concepts of conservation kind of get easily entangled with whatever kind of recreational use they are, or whatever kind of non-recreational kind of ethical use or moral use that land is kind of being described for. So just to move on, Olmsted, this is the guy who kind of designed, was the principal designer behind Central Park. And he's not really known as a conservationist. He's kind of more known as one of the first big landscape architects. And I mean, even he kind of acknowledged that, part of the impetus of Central Park was that most parks were things that only wealthy people could go and see. And so, his concept of this space was that it would be a park that, quote unquote, normal people could use. So people living in Manhattan could go use it instead of needing to take a steamer or something, or take a trip out into the countryside. You'd have a piece of the country right here. So just kind of moving on from this, in Maine and New England, Maine is kind of where we're going to be looking this week. And Percival Baxter is kind of one of those big figures in Maine history for taking a big square of land and saying, no, we're going to conserve this. And so he created Baxter State Park, which is Maine's largest state park. And let's look at it here. And it's a big chunk of land, right? And so what's interesting to me about land management is that a lot of times, even though it is for the good of all, or it's for the public will, it's a very few number of people that decide what happens to all this land, right? I mean, even recently, Roxanne Quimby, the co-founder of Burt's Bees, she bought a bunch of land up in northern Maine and gave it all to the federal government to create a national monument. And so that's called Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. I'll just see if we can pull it up here. Katahdin Woods and Waters. And it's a pretty big chunk of land too. It sits right on the other side of Baxter, and a lot of people at the time that was becoming a monument, it was upsetting to a lot of locals because, what I think it communicated was that instead of the use of this piece of land being decided by the people who are nearby it, suddenly someone comes in and says, okay, we bought all of this land and now we're going to give it to the federal government because that's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do, to preserve this for all time. There were a lot of questions raised about why does the federal government need to come manage this piece of land that has been, there's been lots of activity on it anyway. Not that it matters, but I am a conservationist. And so it was interesting to talk to people about this issue when it was happening in 2016. I was fortunate enough to be a part of an economic development plan for the Millinocket region, and we had a charrette up there, and I'll show you one of the visuals that we made. And I think it's kind of a nice example of how some thematic cartography with a little explanation can be a nice narrative piece, right? And so I think a lot of the tension in the region comes from the loss of industry in resource extraction, which was in this part of the state mostly timber and kind of forestry and lumbering. But there, Baxter State Park, just to demonstrate how much money it brought into the region, I think was helpful. So what the visual tries to show is it's the economics of the region. And so what we're looking at are proportional pie charts that show how much taxable sales by town for the year of 2015 are in this region. And so there's some data paucity. We're not seeing the breakdown for certain towns, but for some of these towns, we're seeing the breakdown of that taxable sales by lodging and by restaurants. So effectively, this is trying to communicate that almost a third of Millinocket's taxable sales for the year of fiscal year of 2015 were in lodging and restaurants. And so that's interesting, but then the question is, okay, well, is that directly related to Baxter? Is that related to recreation? I mean, there's other recreational opportunities in the area as well, so it's not fair to put this all on Baxter, perhaps. But and so this chart at the top, we tried to show that throughout the course of the year, there's kind of this almost like a little miniature heartbeat or something like that, where we see how do the taxable sales change kind of in a monthly manner. And you can kind of see from 2007 for a full decade how this month-to-month thing is definitely a reality, right? We see it's kind of more sporadic at the beginning, but we see this peak in the midsummer, and then there's a big snowmobile culture up there as well. And so there's this kind of midwinter blip that happens pretty regularly from when people go snowmobiling there, and the restaurant and lodging is actually quite active during January, February, and March. And so once we communicated this and then kind of also showed the same curve of how many cars go through the Matagamon Gate and go through the Togue Pond Gate for Baxter State Park, and then kind of just showed the reality of, okay, well, we've got $34 million of taxable sales in Millinocket. Over a quarter of them are from restaurant and lodging. Perhaps, there's no statistical analysis here. We're just kind of drawing a comparison. Perhaps that's somewhat related to these recreational areas, which, they're just jurisdictions. It's just the state says, yes, this is a park, and now the federal government says, yes, this is a monument. So it's definitely an imperfect graphic, but I like the ability of using kind of information graphics and thematic cartography to allow a conversation to be had about other realities of the land that we don't get from just kind of these physical, the normal kind of reference cartography that we're used to. So just so that we can get into Q and start doing stuff, what is the purpose of all this? Why do we care? What does it have to do with New England in particular? One thing I'd like to stress is how different New England land use is, and therefore also conservation is in our region, as opposed to other places in the world. And so New England, was settled by Puritans. It was settled in with horse and carriage, and all of the towns are about 7 miles apart, about the distance you can go to and from town in a day by horse, right? There are big tracts of land that have larger parcels, but they're still largely depopulated. All of the populated areas have this very interesting kind of tightly woven fabric of land ownership that is community based. And so each of these different towns, private citizens have more of an ability, kind of a stake in buying land. And I might get in trouble saying that, but every single town is in charge of its own land use, and they're allowed to pass codes that restrict certain types of development. And every resident, I should say, of a town has the right to vote on a town meeting about how that land will be used. And so conservation in this part of the state is very, very different, and it's very difficult to make these kind of sweeping conservation efforts that we've been talking about. Most other places in the world are pretty different from this, right? I was pretty shocked when I went to Scotland, actually. I stayed there for a few months, and I stayed on a piece of land and was curious about, well, if you want to be a farmer, how do you buy land and how do you do that kind of thing? Most of it is still even I shouldn't say this, but it's semi-feudal, right? There are still lords and large organizations that own giant tracts of land throughout Scotland. And it's private. But, of course, Scotland is different than a lot of places in the world, too, because it's got this kind of free range policy, which is that you can go on private land. There's a law that says you're allowed to walk across other people's lands, whereas in New England, it's kind of, this is mine, that's yours. There's stone walls everywhere and property boundaries and do not trespass kind of signs. So there's trade-offs and benefits to different types of land management, but the New England one is I think really interesting because it's this chessboard in which developers, conservationists, private landowners all kind of vie for different control of different places, and the zoning acts as kind of the rules of the chessboard. So conservation on a local scale in particularly rural New England tends to be a collaborative effort between private landowners and land trusts or nonprofit organizations that are trying to keep land from being developed. And so it's kind of in that frame that the whole week in the whole lab is going to be based around. Is the topic is a product for a collaborative of land trusts that are trying to create an existing conditions or natural resource inventory of sorts for a set of watersheds. And so we'll get started in the next video looking at the data.